Yeah.
Hey.
Just trying to get the presentation set up.
Awesome.
See if I can get it so I have the notes as well. That would be cool. Maybe you can let me know. Oh. Okay. I'm gonna try this one. Ooh, that's a little too meta. So I guess what happens when I'm here?
It looks good.
It looks good? Okay, so what's funny about that is that I can't go back to... Okay, hold on, I have an idea. I think this would fix it.
Thanks for doing that prep, Carol.
Oh yeah, no problem. I'm gonna stop sharing because I think that'll make it Okay, so we'll do that. And then try this again. Okay, that should work, yeah?
Yeah.
That looks good.
Okay, so you see that, and then now I'm just gonna go to a different screen. And you're still just seeing the presentation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, awesome. I think I got it then. Cool.
It does have like the little top bar thingy that has the URL.
Yeah.
Which is kind of
that's
weird.
annoying. Oh,
Yeah.
I can fix that. So if I do that, does it have the...
No, that's better. That's perfect.
Okay, but if I do that, it's full screen, so I can't actually see you all.
Oh, weird. Okay.
So maybe if you don't mind, if we keep it, because otherwise I can't. I'd like to see the chat and everything.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think it's fine. Like yeah, it's fine. It just has your little like icons at the top.
Yeah, all my icons and everything. I don't think I can hide them. Let's see. Menu bar. No, that's that one.
I'm going to let my dog outside so that he doesn't interrupt me. I will be right back.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I don't think I can get rid of that, but I don't mind. People can see that I use a ad blocker. That's okay. I think everyone does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Well.
Cool. Yeah, it's looking good.
I think we're good then. And then I have my notes. And you guys have your notes and everything. You're good on that?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
This works. I guess people are going to start coming in. Oh, we were talking before, Carol, that maybe you could, as moderator, monitor the questions in the chat.
Yes. I'm going to try to do that. Just trying to get myself set up so I can like see everything that I need to see. Okay. And then, yeah, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat, but I think we'll just do questions at the end, right?
I think that would be easiest. Yeah, we were talking about if something was super relevant to what we were talking about, then maybe you could bring it up, but it might only, I guess, if it seems like a quick answer.
Okay. Yeah, if there's something quick, we can try to address it right away.
Like a clarification thing or something.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I think we are ready to go.
Excellent.
So it's 3:00 now. I think people are still coming in. We only have a couple folks listening in right now. Hello. So, but we're glad you're here. Hi, Nora, and hi, Jessica. We'll probably wait a couple minutes, just give people a sec. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Well, this is very meta. I see the presentation in like 3 different places on my screen.
Same here. Because I have 2 screens, so it's like 2 and 2.
Oh man. All right, and y'all can hear me okay? I can hear you guys great.
And so, okay. Carol, I guess we'll just say next, since you're in charge of the slides. Yeah?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I'll probably follow your cadence.
Great.
Hopefully. But feel free to shout if necessary.
Okay.
Cool. All right. How many people do we have now?
Hey, we've got a crowd, 10, right? So
yeah,
awesome.
Let's go.
All right. Well, we should probably get started then. Yeah. We have a lot to talk about today. So welcome everyone to our panel session, breakout session on food in the floodplain, ? Exploring and evaluating the possibilities in Austin, Texas. My name is Carol Fraser, my pronouns are they, them, and I work for the City of Austin's Economic Development Department as the Food Systems Program Coordinator. So I've been invited by Leah Gibson and Sari Albornoz of the Watershed Protection Department, who are going to be presenting some of their research. So we're really excited to get started.
And I'm Leah Gibson. I'm the Green Infrastructure Land Manager for the Watershed Protection Department. I've been with the city for about 10 years. I've been in this role specifically for 4. And basically, I'm responsible for managing all of watershed-owned land, which includes buyouts. And there have been more and more of them over the past few years. And so that's one of the important topics that has come up is, can we grow food in them? And so that's why I'm here today to contribute to that part of the conversation. And I'm also a farmer at home in the Lockhart area. I have a small farm that I operate with my husband.
Everyone, I'm Sari Albornoz. I work for the Watershed Protection Department too as a community engagement planner. I actually joined the department to do this research that we're about to present today, working with Leah. And I'm also a graduate student at the Community and Regional Planning Program at University of Texas, and a co-founder of a small nonprofit that's getting started called Fruitful Commons.
Yeah. All right. So we're exploring a possibility in this presentation and in general. And the possibility is related to the idea of growing food in publicly owned floodplain buyout land. We're really guided by these questions that you see on the screen. Can publicly owned floodplain buyout lands serve as sites for growing food and fostering community resilience in the heart of urban areas? And how would this type of project look if racial equity were truly prioritized? So why does this possibility matter? We really believe that if it's viable to grow food in floodplain land, that represents a really exciting opportunity that has implications for Austin, but also for other places around the country. If we can do this in an equitable and environmentally just way, we can apply the lessons that we've learned to other kinds of projects. And of course, there's really exciting possibilities for community and economic development that come out of projects like these, such as increased access to local and fresh foods, job creation, increased local economic activity, and improved community amenities and open space. So because of both the increased threat of climate change and historic development patterns in hazard-prone areas, local governments all over the country are moving people out of harm's way through buyouts. This leaves vacant, publicly owned land that cannot be traditionally developed. So this represents a new abnormal, as we're calling it, as it's called in the literature. A recent FEMA model, the Federal Agency on Disaster Management, estimates that 40 million people are now at risk for catastrophic inland flooding. And with more erratic and intense rains caused by climate change, inland bayous, creeks, rivers, etc., will overflow more frequently. And we have better and updated data now that provides us with a reason to redraw floodplain maps as governments. So due to all of these factors, climate change, increased flooding risk, US cities, including Austin, have been purchasing homes that are located in hazard-prone areas. And after carefully evaluating the options for flood risk reduction. Sometimes floodplain buyouts emerge as the most effective way to move residents out of harm's way. This constitutes what's called managed retreat, and FEMA has funded over 43,000 voluntary buyouts of flood-prone properties since 1989. So studies that have looked at the buyouts and the data coming out of those processes are showing that floodplain buyouts have disproportionate impacts on socially vulnerable populations. The impacts of flooding and buyouts are more negative on people of color and communities of color for many reasons, including the fact that people of color in low-income communities are more likely to live in such hazard-prone areas, and these are areas where land values are therefore lower. Many people who live in communities of color are likely to be renters, and they may not have renter's insurance. And non-English speakers and those with lower educational attainment are likely to have difficulty navigating the administrative processes related to buyouts and flood recovery. So these are the kind of data that we're keeping in mind as we investigate the possibilities of using floodplain buyout land in the future. And as I kind of mentioned, there are many different challenges, but also opportunities that come with floodplain buyout land. So, of course, the challenges that arise are primarily due to the displacement of communities and people that occur as they may move away after they sell their land. And that can really fragment communities. And it also leaves behind undevelopable land in its wake. There's a question of what to do with the lands that get bought out. However, there's also benefits that could come out of this managed retreat process. So there are outdoor community spaces that are generated. These become gathering places that promote health, for example, parks. Of course, there's land that mitigates flooding. It also acts as carbon sinks and places for carbon sequestration, opportunities for habitat restoration, such as wildflower meadows and restored wetlands. And there's the possibility for food production, which could increase access to food, as well as resilience and, in an equitable way, increase access to food. For example, sustainable urban agriculture. So as a local government, as a city of Austin, we have the opportunity to use floodplain lands, and they're growing in number due to that kind of increased amount of data that we have about floodplains and climate change. We can use these lands in a way that actually generates benefits for communities. So over the past few decades, the city of Austin has purchased over 1,000 homes. That's helped move residents out of harm's way throughout the city. And in response to community interest, which we'll get into in a few moments, the city of Austin is evaluating the possibility of using buyout lands, specifically in Lower Onion Creek, for food production. And this is the opportunity that the City of Austin's Watershed Protection Department is exploring, and this is what we're going to talk with you about today. So now I'm going to turn to my excellent colleagues at the city's Watershed Protection Department. Leah, take it away.
All right. So first I want to introduce the project area and its location. This is along Onion Creek in Southeast Austin near Pleasant Valley and William Cannon. It's in the Dove Springs community. There's some existing parkland in the area. There's the Onion Creek Greenbelt. There's a dog park and a playground. And there's also a couple of elementary schools, specifically Perez Elementary, which is in the project area, but outside of the floodplain. If you look at the map, you'll see a lot of streets. There used to be an entire neighborhood here. It was filled with houses. This area experienced catastrophic flooding multiple times in the past few decades. Most recently, that you might remember is 2013 and 2015. And with the help of FEMA grants, voluntary buyouts actually started in 1998. But the Halloween floods of 2013 and 15 compelled most people to accept that offer. You can move on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what happens in the buyout process. How do we go from a neighborhood to just open space? First, like Carol mentioned, there are many other options that are evaluated and looked at and trying to find the best way to remove people from flood risk. We're talking like about flood walls, channel widening, detention ponds, everything is considered. But ultimately, buyouts might be the best way to remove folks from dangerous areas and in situations where homes probably should have never been built. So in the buyout process, homeowners are offered a fair market value for their home, and they're also offered other costs like relocation. Once they move out and relocate, the property is inspected for asbestos and lead. If needed, there's an abatement process, and then it's demolished. And the slab is broken up and removed. And in some cases, topsoil might be brought in. And utilities like the water, wastewater, those are capped at the curb. And then the site's leveled, it's reseeded. There's usually some kind of erosion matting, and then we let it grow. And so after it starts growing, that's when our department takes over the management of the property. We usually initiate some sort of community engagement process after the vegetation's been growing for a year or so. We'll reach out to the community and say, you know, what would you like? How would you like us to manage this? We wait a year because that allows enough time for the neighbors to really develop feelings about it. You know, when there's a house there, or even when it looks like this photo, it's kind of hard to imagine it as like a grassy field or, you know, what have you. So we give them some time to kind of sit with it and develop feelings and ideas about long-term management. So our default plan, as soon as we take over the management, we just add it to our mowing list. We have a contractor who mows all of our buyouts. Depending on the location, it's mowed 4 to 6 times per year. And then, like I said, we engage the community after the project's is completed. Some of the things that that communities might like to see are restoration, complete restoration. Sometimes we'll just stop mowing and walk away and connect them with resources to plant trees and tackle invasive species, things like that. Sometimes we'll plant wildflower seeds and reduce our mowing. And sometimes communities might want to actually like really get involved in stewarding the property and plant fruit trees, build a community garden, implement some kind of trail system, and more. Okay, so in this project specifically, a lot of the buyout area actually became dedicated parkland in 2019, and that's called, currently it's called the Onion Creek Metro Park North. And there's pavilions, there's a dog park, there's creek access, a playground, bathrooms, parking, and then some restoration areas as well. The watershed has maintained management of the areas that you see in blue on this map. So our initial community engagement in this area was started in late 2018. And we wanted to get an idea of how people are using the area currently and how they feel about different options for long-term uses. And we heard during that process, we heard a lot of support for community agriculture. We received about 250 responses total, and there was a strong support for other uses as well, restoration, wildflowers, tree planting, wildlife habitat, things like that. And of course, urban agriculture and orchards. And so GAVA hosted a follow-up focus group at Perez Elementary the following spring. And that was a really interesting conversation. We learned a lot. There was a lot of interest in sustainable agriculture projects, but what we are hearing from people is that, like, we would like to see this, we would like to participate in this, but we don't really have the bandwidth to do this on our own. We are working families. We can't dedicate all of our weekends to like building some project from the ground up. So there's a lot of excitement about the concept that a farming project or an agriculture project could be managed by an external organization, but then community members could somehow be involved through either education or volunteering, or just having access to fresh produce. So that was a scenario that we wanted to look into a lot more, potentially leasing this land to a community organization to carry out their own operation, but with certain expectations and commitments. And that's the concept that we've been exploring for this specific research. And then, when the pandemic hit, there was a new surge of community members really wanting to figure out how to bring a project like this to light. But one person specifically said, "This is public land, and I should be able to grow food here." And we agree, and we want to help, but we also want to make sure that we do this the right way. We don't want time and resources to be wasted, and we want to do this so that it's replicable. But most of all, we don't want to be inviting folks into a potentially harmful situation. So for these reasons, this issue becomes a delicate balance. This buyout area is located in a neighborhood with a high percentage of people of color and a high percentage of people living under the federal poverty line. The recent severe flooding has had serious and lasting negative impacts on both the neighbors who moved away and those who remain in the area. And like much of Austin, the neighborhood is also experiencing strong gentrification pressures. So any project that's implemented in the buyout area has the potential to be carried out in a way that promotes racial equity or exacerbates existing inequities. So we want this approach to be respectful. We want this to be done in an inclusive way that brings material benefits to the neighborhood's community members, both those who remain living nearby, but also those who have moved on. And what we don't want to do is approach this in a way that brings harm to the neighborhood by failing to include community members in decisions about the site. We can't miss any opportunities to prioritize community members for benefits generated through any project that happens here. So attention must also be paid to the potential to increase gentrification pressures by increasing the desirability of the site. So we're placing a priority on racial equity in both the research side of things, but also the implementation stage of the project. So we started looking at what parcels we could potentially use for this project. In this map, each of the black outlined squares was a home. And the parcels that are outlined in white are the people that declined to participate in the buyout program. So there are some people still living there. So we chose these parcels because they were contiguous areas that remained in watershed management, but they were also set aside a little bit from the existing homes so that we could give privacy to those who didn't take the buyout, and but also not have something in their backyard. And then one of the parcels we chose is across from Perez Elementary. In the event that this project offers some kind of outdoor education benefit or opportunity, we wanted it to be accessible for those reasons. So as I started diving into this research that needed to be done in order to identify some sort of process for this, I quickly realized that I lacked the bandwidth to get this done in a timely fashion at the level of detail that it really needed. And we have community gardens on other watershed properties, and I'm aware of everything that goes into that process. It's a lot. And so in the community garden context, I'm working with nonprofits, I'm working with other city departments and neighborhood groups, and all of these people are working together to get something off the ground. But this is a lot bigger, potentially more intense, and there's not really a precedent. So at least not that the city has implemented so far. So one of the people that's always helped me and been a partner in agriculture-based projects in the past has been Saudi Albornoz. She previously worked at the Sustainable Food Center as the Community Gardens Program Manager. And so I worked with her in that role for many years. And one day she came up to me and said that she let me know she was going to grad school and that she was proposing this exact topic for her research. So we were very fortunate to bring her on to kind of dive into this topic at the depth that it really needs. And so she has a lot of information as well, and I'm going to hand it over to her for that portion.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of information, and it's been a lot of fun to dive into, many wormholes here. So these are the two perspective areas that you saw highlighted on the map on the last slide. On the left are the 2 parcels that we've kind of started calling the Northwest parcels, which are adjacent to Perez Elementary School, as Leah mentioned. So you can see in the photo that there's a couple of houses that remain on the end of the block near Teal Trail, and there actually does look like there's a 3rd house, but that has since been removed. And then on the right photo is what we're calling the Southeast parcel, and that one doesn't have any houses remaining, even though there's one that was there when this picture was taken. So next slide. And so to answer our 2 main research questions, we gathered information about several sub-questions. These were, what do agriculture projects need for success? And what kind of a tolerance for risk do they have? Meaning, what degree of risk from flooding would truly threaten their viability? We also looked into what the exact nature of flooding was like at these prospective agriculture parcels, and then what the implications were for safety for people working there. We looked into the soil quality and the soil safety, and also what kinds of regulatory constraints agriculture projects operating here would face. We looked into appropriate land management practices to steward the riparian ecosystem of Onion Creek. And then also we looked into how to build racial equity into this entire process. So through all of that, we generated a few scenarios in which we thought agriculture could be viable at the site. And we gathered this information in a few different ways. We interviewed city staff, staff at local agricultural nonprofits, Central Texas farmers, and then subject area experts from across the nation. And we also interviewed staff that were working on, or that are working on similar projects in other cities. We released a City of Austin request for information seeking input from farmers and community leaders in this area about what an agriculture project would need to succeed at this site. And then we also did research into academic and media articles, environmental data, policy documents, and reports. And then we worked with the consultant to perform a phase 1 environmental assessment. And then finally, we located remaining utility infrastructure at the site. So through all of this, we learned that different types of agriculture projects have different needs depending on the specific type and scale of the project. But generalizing across project types, agriculture projects need these things to succeed. They need some kind of basic site features that are conducive to agriculture. So good direct sunlight, healthy soil that's free from toxins, a flat area, public access and access for vehicles, and enough space to grow the food you need. Equipment like garden tools and machinery like tractors, waste receptacles, also infrastructure like a water tap and a water meter, irrigation, secure storage, some kind of shade structure, and then a few more. I won't list all of them because there were a lot, but there's also wash pack station, cold storage, a greenhouse, and then a drinking fountain, rainwater collection, and more. So we also learned that agriculture projects have some less tangible needs, including a reasonable level of risk from flooding, as you might expect. Also, a land use agreement that is at least 10 years. People really emphasize that if somebody's going to invest in the site, they need to know that their investment is going to have time to pay off, whether that's in terms of money or community benefits or whatever. Insurance is necessary, administrative support, particularly for community-run projects like community gardens, where it may be just a bunch of neighbors or volunteers who are spending their time there. City support, so that could be in terms of funding, but also a commitment to help with cleanup in the event that another flood, event does occur. Community buy-in and participation, and then leaders and or farm labor that has skills, access to markets if the produce is being sold, a clear mission, and then enough funding. So we also learned that within a particular kind of floodplain, the nature of flooding can actually vary pretty dramatically. And so it's really important to get a sense of what flooding is like at a very specific location. And so we did that by talking to Watershed's floodplain engineers. And we also learned that what matters for the purposes of agriculture projects is how deep floodwaters are projected to get at that spot during storm events, how fast they're expected to flow over the site, and then how long they're expected to remain on the site before subsiding. So at this prospective agriculture site, severe flooding is expected in both 25-year and 100-year storms, which are pretty rare. 25-year storms have a 4% chance of occurring every year, and 100-year storms have a 1% chance of happening every year. But in those kinds of events, we are expecting upwards of 6 feet at the southeast parcel and upwards of 4 feet at the northwest parcel. In a 10-year storm, which has a 10% chance of occurring each year, the southeast parcel is expected to flood, but not the northwest ones. And so we're looking at 1 foot of flooding in the southeast parcel. And then in a 2-year storm, which has a 50% chance of happening each year, neither is expected to flood. So despite pretty low annual chances of severe flooding happening, the Halloween floods of 2013 and 2015, which were 2 catastrophic floods that happened back to back, show us how damaging flooding can be at the site. You can see those impacts in those pictures that we're showing. And those floods also showed us why it was so important to move people out of this hazardous area. And unfortunately, with climate change, events like these are probably going to become more common at the site. We learned that flooding can have a variety of negative impacts on agriculture projects. So I looked at a study that was done in New England on impacts on farms from Tropical Storm Irene. And what they learned was that flooding can have impacts including the loss of crops and equipment, soil contamination, waterlogged soil, deposition of sediment, erosion, harm to trees, and more. And that one of the reasons flooding can cause crop loss is that per FDA regulations, crops touched by floodwaters are considered contaminated, and so they're not allowed to be sold. I should specify that that refers to waters that come onto the site from elsewhere, not rainwater pooled at the site, which is considered fine. So because of flooding and also because of other factors, there are several safety concerns that need to be taken into account for this site. Those include flood protocols to keep people safe. That would really be important to have. We learned that it's too dangerous to keep livestock at the site because there would not necessarily be enough time to go to the site and move the animals in time for floodwaters, before floodwaters happened. Also, because the site is a little bit isolated and downhill from the neighborhoods that are nearby, we heard from one community organizer who works in the area that she would be a little concerned for the safety of seniors, especially who have mobility issues, or also others who might just feel a little unsafe working there. If contaminants did wash in a flood event, that could put people in danger of exposure to those contaminants. And then there's also a risk of vandalism and theft, again, because of the isolation of the site. We learned from talking to people at the Intervale, which is a farm incubator project in a floodplain in Burlington, Vermont, that's also a bit isolated, that they have a lot of experiences with theft and vandalism, unfortunately. So that would be something we would want to be aware of. So these images on the screen that you'll see are on the left, there's a flooded field, and that's from the Intervale from flooding that happened in 2015 there. The middle one is actually crazy erosion that happened at Johnson's Backyard Garden farm in the 2015 Halloween flood when Dry Creek flooded its banks, changed its path, and then carved a giant channel right through the farm. So because of all this risk, and because farmers just told us so, who we talked to, we think that commercial agriculture projects are probably not viable at this site because the risk of crop loss is just too significant. So this is what somebody from FarmShare Austin told us, that essentially as a for-profit farmer, she would have a lot of qualms, and that it might be a safer bet for an organization, a nonprofit organization, or another kind of program that had another source of funding that wasn't just depending on the crops for survival. So next slide. Right, so moving on to other characteristics. Also, I just want to note that we're going to address all the questions at the end. We're seeing them there, and we just want to make sure we get through everything, give you all the information, and then we will definitely get to your questions. So moving on to other site characteristics, we learned that the site is located actually almost fully on prime farmland, and this is based on data from the National Resource Conservation, National Resource Conservation Service soil database. But unfortunately, in reality, the soil is actually a patchwork of quality. And that's because the soil under houses and driveway footprints is construction fill that is very compacted from being underneath those houses and driveways all those years. We also found that there's utilities remaining at the site from the neighborhood that was there before. And in some cases, this is actually helpful, like the fact that potable water service lines run all throughout. That could be tapped into for the agriculture. In other cases, it's a problem that needs to be addressed. Like there's a bunch of AT&T cabinets and buried cables that we would need to take out. Another important issue that we're actually still researching is the safety of the soil at the site. So in 2018, there was a preliminary screening done that Leah headed up, and that found that there were no toxins at levels of concern at the site. But then in 2020, we did work with the consultant, as I mentioned before, to do a phase 1 environmental assessment. And from that, the consultant recommended that we do additional, more rigorous soil testing just because of the intended use of growing food there. And then we did find some additional information that that Watershed had that kind of affirms the need for more rigorous testing, which is that before the demolition of the house materials were tested for both lead and asbestos. And as you'll see on this map, there was actually lead and asbestos found in many of the houses. And there was abatement done for the asbestos, but it's not able to be done for the lead. And so there is a chance that little, particles of lead paint got in the soil. So we definitely want to make sure we know whether that's a concern before moving forward. So I'm going to hand it over to Leah now to talk about the regulatory constraints that an agriculture project would need to negotiate here.
Great. Great. So another tricky thing to figure out with all of this is floodplain regulations. So as a city, we're responsible for not just creating, but also enforcing floodplain regulations. These are standards that the city has to follow for its own projects, but it's also made for private developers and residents to follow. They were created with the intent to protect lives, property, and the environment by preventing development from occurring in the floodplain that could cause adverse impact. Adverse impact means that it could alter the way water flows across an area such that flooding is worsened elsewhere, like adding impervious cover. Another thing would be to add infrastructure that could become dislodged by floodwaters, and then it would be like a floating hazardous debris. It could run into something and cause problems, or it could clog a creek downstream. There's a lot that could go wrong with these items, with building these kind of items in a floodplain. We also don't want to alter a landscape in a way that would cause erosion or diminish water quality. So what does that mean for a project like this, and how does it affect the infrastructure needs? When we took every piece of infrastructure that farmers told us that they might need, and we went to our floodplain office, the engineers, and we talked through them for many hours. We talked through each of the options, and so this is the result of that conversation. Things like the water tap, irrigation, electricity, those would not be affected. Low row covers, pathways, portable equipment, and composting, as long as it's on a small scale, also not really affected by floodplain regulations. However, when we get into more structural based things, that's where we start running into an area where we really need to coordinate with floodplain engineers to get approval. So fencing, for example, we need to have a certain type of fencing that allows water to flow through without the fencing catching debris or impeding the flow of water somehow. Any type of structure, whether it's for shade or a gathering structure, it must be open to allow water to flow through, no walls. The same goes for a wash pack station. It would have to be designed in a way where there's no walls. We could also encourage people to consider portable or modular systems. Picnic tables and seating, they have to be anchored in a way that they don't float off in a storm, in a flood. And then large equipment could be possible to use at the site, but it would have to be stored off-site. And then things that would not be permitted, anything that has 4 walls and a roof. So a tool shed. We know that that's a big need, but there are other options that we want to encourage, like maybe a cargo trailer or a box trailer that that could be retrofitted to be a tool shed, that could be moved off site. That might also help for security concerns. So a bathroom would not be permitted, although there is a bathroom nearby at the park that could be used. Cold storage would not be permitted. However, we hope to develop a potential partnership with the elementary school, and that might be something that could be a shared resource. Greenhouses would not be permitted. Rainwater collection, any type of classroom or housing. And in other areas, in another watershed land, we do have a tool shed, but it's elevated above the flood level, which is only 1 foot there. And in this area, like Sadi was talking about earlier, you're talking about 4 feet of water. Well, you can't elevate something 4 feet without it becoming a 2-story building. So another thing to consider are our land management practices, to make sure that we're playing our role in stewarding a healthy riparian ecosystem. So we want to minimize erosion by not leaving our soil bare, keeping it covered with either cover crops or mulch, minimal to no tillage, incorporating organic matter to improve soil quality, and also making sure that we leave a generous riparian buffer. And ways we can protect water qualities by not using chemical fertilizers, no herbicides or pesticides, only organic methods. Apply compost conscientiously to avoid high nutrient loads, plant biodiverse crops, no monocultures, and then also no livestock, as in some cases, they can contribute to a nutrient load, but at the same time, probably worse is that they could be washed away during a flood. So those are some of the the management practices on these farms that would have to adhere to.
We've been talking about the insights that we gathered about our first overarching research question, which is whether an agriculture project could be viable at this site. But we haven't talked yet about the other question, which is what it would look like if racial equity were prioritized. So to answer this question, we spoke with Austin's Equity Office, representatives of nonprofit and community-based organizations that are active in the Dove Springs neighborhood, which is where the prospective agriculture site is located, and an individual who grew up in the Buyout area. And we heard these key points. First, the planning process for this effort has to be inclusive. We need to do robust community engagement on the front end of the process, not after a bunch of decisions have been made. And we need to prioritize inviting community-based organizations that already work in the area for any opportunities related to the site. So don't just open it up to any nonprofit around town, really give priority to the people that are already working there in Dove Springs. We also need to prioritize the perspectives of flood survivors and be aware that people really did experience severe trauma and harm from the flooding that has happened pretty recently at this site. So really be sensitive to that. We have to invite those people. I mean, we don't have to, we should, we will invite those people who have been displaced from the neighborhood to weigh in on the use of the site if they choose. And then to use the city's equity tool to guide the planning process. The other big overarching point is that we should seek ways to improve the material conditions for the people who live in the area. So we should think about who will benefit and who will pay for whatever kind of project that happens. Prioritize creating opportunities for current and displaced residents. So that could be jobs. It could be some kind of opportunity to take home money from the sale of crops, maybe training or education, maybe just food. And then to be aware of the potential for gentrification to be exacerbated. As we mentioned before, there already are gentrification pressures in this neighborhood, as there are all over Austin. And so we need to be aware of that and seek ways to mitigate those forces. We also need to make sure that the project doesn't become an exclusive white space, which could happen unintentionally. And we need to build in a system of accountability to our equity-based goals. So putting all of this together, we think that there's several scenarios where an agriculture project at the site could actually be successful. A couple of project types that we think could work are food forests or agroforestry projects, and that's because those are projects where it's a biodiverse group of food crops that are all planted together. The way that those projects work, it enriches the soil and improves the soil quality, kind of anchors it down with roots and really would mitigate erosion. and also would steward the riparian ecosystem well. Another possibility could be community fruit and nut orchards, especially kind of highlighting the fact that pecan trees are pretty flood tolerant. So that could be a good choice for the spot. A tree nursery, as you can see pictured in one of these pictures, which the idea there is a place to grow tiny saplings into a size that's big enough to go plant elsewhere. That could work. And then a community garden or a non-commercial education or job training garden or farm. And in those two cases, there might be a mobile tool shed or a partnership with Perez Elementary, which we haven't mentioned, but Perez is out of the floodplain. That's why we keep talking about that as a potential site to put stuff. And you know, it could be a mutually beneficial relationship also. So those could be scenarios for those types of projects. Also, the projects would need to use some type of modified or alternative infrastructure to comply with floodplain regulations. And a couple scenarios for that are a mobile tool shed or trailer. There's a kind of a cool design that here that could work. Again, a partnership with the elementary school for the cold storage or equipment storage, especially if the project is located at the northwest parcels. And then this is kind of a cool possibility. There could be an apiary using raised beehives. So you can see this little sky hive, yellow beehive here that is on a super sturdy pole and raised up super high. The bees don't have any problem flying up there. So that could be a possibility too. The other thing that we would need to consider is we heard loud and clear that projects will need robust city support for success. And so that means a long enough land use agreement to make the investment worthwhile, investment from the city in basic infrastructure and a commitment to help with cleanup and recovery from flooding. And then a courtesy design review from the floodplain office. And so what that means is having a chance to show proposed project designs to the floodplain office before actually submitting a proposal, so that if there's some kind of ambiguity with whether something complies with floodplain regulations, that can be kind of talked through and worked out rather than having to submit a proposal and then have it be rejected because something wasn't quite right. Yeah. And so we're excited about what we've found, and we're ready to jump into next steps to move the process forward. And those next steps are first to go ahead and conduct that more rigorous soil testing and to pursue any remediation that we realize is needed to get the site up to clean standards. To identify funding to support the effort, like we've been mentioning through basic infrastructure and the other kinds of support. So kind of looking into what can the city provide at no cost to the group that would use the site. And we're still working on this because it's going to involve partnerships between multiple departments to find those funds. And then reinitiate the community engagement process, which would kind of be a phase 2 following what was started in 2018. Create protocols for use of the site, and then also a land use agreement that would be between the city and whatever group used the site. And then identify organizations to lead the effort using the city's equity tool and input from community members. And then finally, figure out ways to make the project replicable so that projects like this can happen at other publicly managed floodplain properties, both in Austin and beyond. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Carol to talk about how a project like this could bring about economic development opportunities, and then also some other projects from which we're drawing inspiration.
Thanks, y'all. And as someone put in the chat, this is super fascinating work. So it's really great to hear about all these details that need to be considered. Really quickly, I want to make sure we have time to get to the questions in the chat. So really quickly, just to highlight some of the potential community and economic development opportunities that come out of projects in the floodplain. First and foremost, to the extent that we're able to generate more economic activity in our local food system, this means that there's more money that's staying locally. So for every dollar of direct spending that people spend on food in Austin, there's 86 cents of other spending that's induced. And for every one job that's created, there's another half position, you could say, that's created. So you can see that there's a ripple effect when we invest in and when we have more food projects and food businesses of all kinds in our city. And then, of course, there's community community benefits. I think a lot of them were mentioned throughout the presentation. There's opportunities for learning how to grow food, potentially, building skills that enable people to become farmers themselves or open other kinds of small businesses. And there's opportunities to share meals and build community in a beautiful, beautiful public space. So there are a few examples of projects from other places that were inspired by the Intervale Center in Vermont that we've mentioned. It is a project located in a 100-year floodplain, so slightly less likely to flood than the Onion Creek area. And you can see from the map where they've left some land for forest use, but they're really farming it quite intensively right at a kind of bottomland floodplain area. And this is currently home to 8 different farms. They also have a food hub that brings in food from about 45 different farms around the region. And they also have had some serious issues with flooding over the years. Hurricane Irene was a really big deal, and kind of the remnants hit that part of Vermont. And the losses from the farms at Intervale Center were $750,000 from Hurricane Irene alone. So kind of like we mentioned about the potential for commercial agriculture in Onion Creek is limited because of this kind of flooding risk, and we can see what happens in other places when the flooding does happen. So just to quickly mention, with Hurricane Irene, that one of the farms at the Intervale Center put out a call for volunteers to come and save all of these carrots. As you can see, they're harvesting carrots very quickly because, like Sadi mentioned, if there's floodwaters on crops, you can't sell them legally. So that's a really big issue. You have to have that kind of community involvement from the get-go in order to potentially deal with some of the flooding risks as they occur. Another really exciting example is a little bit closer to home. So this is Opal's farm in Fort Worth, Texas. This farm is named after a legendary community activist, Opal Lee. At 92 years old, she realized her dream of seeing an urban farm providing fresh, nutritious food in her neighborhood. So her farm, named after her, is a 5 acres along the Trinity River. You can see there. Just east of downtown Fort Worth. And the land that they are farming on is actually leased by the Tarrant Regional Water District for the express purposes of creating an urban farm. It's 100% organic methods. They're really careful about soil conservation and the environment. And last year was its first season. They produced 4,500 pounds of food. Now, they're kind of more of a nonprofit farm model. So their goal from the get-go has been to donate 10% of their crops to the food bank and then sell the rest at retail price and at lower prices for lower income communities. So this farm has created neighborhood jobs, it's provided job training, and it's bringing a spirit of entrepreneurship to the area. So this is a really inspiring example of equity in action. The economic development that's being pursued in this project brings material benefits to the members of the community in East Fort Worth who have been historically marginalized and underserved. And this picture of the ribbon cutting is just so exciting. You can feel their excitement, which I love. And then another example from Michigan, and I encourage you all to check this one out, Urbandale Farm. This is really an urban farm in, again, the 100-year floodplain in an urban area in Lansing. And they've been around since 2010, operating for many years an apprenticeship program. They had about 40 different adult apprentices come through their program and learn how to farm. And many of them went on to become farmers themselves. They've got about 2 acres in production right now. And I just wanted to highlight quickly, you can see the satellite view of how they're really integrated into an urban area where people are still living. I don't think this is a buyout area per se, but they are within the 100-year floodplain, which turns out much of the neighborhood is in as well. As you can see in that little red square, and the blue there highlights the floodplain area. And they've really turned what's kind of a remediated, revegetated, or underutilized space into a community amenity, and they've done it in a way that's brought food and jobs and kind of cultural and community activity to their neighborhood. So those are kind of the examples that we're looking to as we think about what the next steps are with the site and what is potentially possible in the Onion Creek area or elsewhere in Austin. So we've seen what's possible in other ways. We're considering all the different options and ways to mitigate risks. So it's up to us, as a community, not only as staff, but everybody to keep working together to see a truly community beneficial and community driven project in this area. So, our call to action for those of you on the call, first of all, thanks so much for listening. If you think that this is something we should continue to pursue, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you more. It takes so much community involvement to make a project like this happen. And we want to, acknowledge that other groups across town, Williamson Creek Greenbelt, for example, they're working with Community Powered Workshop, and they're kind of a grassroots-led group that's really driving positive change in their neighborhood, which we'd love to see. So that kind of work is so important to these kind of projects. So voice your support if you have it, or come to us with your concerns and questions. And if you're in another city, we want to learn from you, and we'd love to share kind of more in detail if that's useful as well. So please reach out. And now we'll have some time for Q&A. So I'm going to just start with some of the questions from earlier. So in terms of the question around what are funds that would pay for the project leadership and planning facilitation, Sadi and Leah, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah. And
I think this would be around like the community engagement piece and also a potential kind of operator of the space.
Yeah, and I guess it really depends on what this project ends up looking like. So it's hard to say. Up until now, Watershed has funding for a certain level of engagement, community engagement, and taking this to so far as to releasing a request for proposals if that's where this ends up. So we can take it that far, and then we would really need a lot of help from the community when it comes to evaluating proposals. Some of the work Sadi did on kind of figuring out how to incorporate the community into the decision-making process, that would be done at a community level. And then the actual project itself would have to have its own business model that's sustainable and successful in order to succeed. Hopefully I answered that correctly. Sadi, do you have anything to add?
I guess I would just cite some of the internal funding sources that do exist within the city for projects like this. Like the Neighborhood Partnering Program, which is in Public Works, has funds it's kind of a matching funds program where you put in volunteer hours and then they can contribute a grant towards really any kind of improvement project that's on city land in a neighborhood, but they have funded a lot of community gardens. There's also Austin Public Health mini grants that go towards agriculture projects. And there's other kinds, there's a lot of funding that exists kind of both in the city, but also just in the community that can be applied towards this kind of project. And so what might actually end up happening further down the line is some kind of a collaboration where the Watershed Protection Department and other city departments might work with a community group to figure out a funding scenario where it was a combination of foundation grants and city funding and maybe even crowdfunding. I mean, who knows? So, but I think the idea is that we would kind of offer as much support as we could, both with existing funding and with locating additional funding in order to make this successful.
Great. Thanks, y'all. And let's see, next question. So given the resource requirements you've laid out to build community agriculture projects or parks in the floodplain, what happens when the area inevitably floods again? So essentially, what happens when we do have that catastrophic flooding event to this kind of project?
You unmuted yourself. I didn't know if you were going to go first.
I mean, I can. Sure. Okay, and then, okay. So what comes to mind first is there's actually a ton of guidance out there from the FDA and also a lot of agricultural extension offices for post-flood protocols for farms, and those could really provide a lot of helpful guidance. making sure you build in a buffer between flooded areas and other parts of the cropland so that you're not cross-contaminating, or wearing personal protective equipment as you're walking over the site, making sure that you're careful if there's a bunch of sediment that has come in, because sometimes that's not all the way settled and you could fall through, and there's a bunch of detail. And so we would want to draw from those resources and have, translate that into some kind of post-flooding protocols. Also, there's things like, one thing that we've learned is that in a catastrophic flood, or even just a large flood, it's not just the flooding at the site, it's also what might wash up from elsewhere. And so if there was another 100-year flood, we would want to make sure that we were checking whether there were any sewage lift stations upstream that failed. Those are the kind of systems that are used to move sewage from lower to higher elevations on their way to the treatment plants. And back in the 2013 Halloween flood, there were actually a few of those that failed just because of the scale of flooding. So we would want to look at what are things that could flood, that could be sources of contamination, and did they flood? Did they put contaminants in the water? And then test the soil. So there's all of this information that is currently floating around in my research brain would get organized, and we would all put it together and create protocols so we would know exactly what to do in the event of a flood. And then we would want to make sure that there were city resources committed to helping out with cleanup. So maybe that means watershed staff would come out and help move debris and do things like that. And Leah can probably speak to this better than me, so I'll turn.
Yeah, I mean, probably just that we would offer any physical help that we have in-house crews that could do some of those tasks. And I think just adding to what Sadi said is the idea is to make sure that on the front end of this project that we're doing everything we can to make this as least harmful as possible when the next flood comes. So by not allowing certain things, it might seem really tricky and hard, but after a flood, when you're not, when you didn't lose your entire tool shed and everything inside of it, I think you'll be really grateful that you had the opportunity to just move your portable tool shed out of the danger zone.
Great, thanks, y'all. I think we're being invited to share this research again at the Austin Travis County Food Policy Board meeting, so we'll help with that. Thanks, Heather.
Sign me up.
Yeah, I think we're definitely interested. So Nora's question. So with these flood levels, I guess at the Onion Creek site, does that take into account increased water runoff as the city is growing and there's more impervious cover that's laid down across the city or in the city center?
Yeah, so the floodplain is the most up-to-date floodplain that, as we understand it, with all of the recent models, taking into account the Atlas 14 changes. So in fact, when we started this project, the floodplain was a lot different, and we were dealing with a 100-year floodplain, and which was a little easier to envision a project in. And since we started looking at this, we incorporated the Atlas 14 floodplain models, and that has changed and made this area a 25-year floodplain. So that's one of the challenges that we've already kind of had to work with. And the engineers will always keep us up to date on any changes to the modeling or anything that could affect this.
I'll add to that really quick too, that this is actually something I didn't realize and had to have it kind of explained to me, but the Atlas 14 it was a study done of historic rainfall data by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association and like the National Weather Service, I think. And it was based on the last, I believe, 30 years of rainfall data. So it actually doesn't account for climate change. So that's just something that we at the Watershed Protection Department are aware of. We are aware that it's probably going to get worse, but it's what the difference is between that data and what we had before is that it's just more data. And so that bigger quantity of data made it more clear that actually we have rainfall and more severe storms than we had thought. And that's why that adjustment was made to the floodplains, because we were just accounting for that difference. But yeah, and then also I think me as a relative newbie to all this watershed stuff, I'm able to sort of have a sense of what isn't apparent. I also didn't realize that the floodplain modeling is based on this fully developed scenario. So it's actually based on the idea that there's more development in Austin than there even is right now. And so like the idea is that everything is developed out to the maximum amount that is allowed per regulations, and that's what's modeled. And so the impervious cover that's being built is supposed to be mitigated as it's being built by like flood control, stormwater control management infrastructure. And so I guess there's just something that I've been learning from my watershed planning colleagues is that there's a big difference between unmitigated impervious cover and mitigated impervious cover. Like if you put down a parking lot and no detention pond, that's one thing. But if you put down a parking lot and a detention pond, that shouldn't have a huge impact on the downstream flooding. So that's my understanding of.
Very interesting. Thanks, y'all. Well, it's 4:00 here in Austin. I just wanted to call attention to that. I think we're okay to keep answering questions, but I'm also not sure if we'll get automatically kicked off. So at some point, so I just wanted to say, if that happens, thank you so much for listening. And I'll put the contact info here just quickly so you can see that. But if Leah and Sari still have a moment to keep answering questions, we could keep doing that. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
great. So let's see another one. So in your research, have you found out how insurance works for a community project like this in a floodplain?
Well, our existing community gardens are required to have insurance, although we don't know quite yet what this would look like. Sadi, do you have like a more profound answer than that?
I mean, not really, because there's not like, I mean, there's farm flood insurance is a thing, but like community garden flood insurance is not a thing. So I feel like we're kind of in a little bit of like new territory here, or at least uncommon territory. So it's I know the city requires community gardens that are located on city land to have liability insurance, like a certain level of liability insurance. But that's not the same as flood insurance. So my thought is that probably we would be requiring liability insurance for a project like this, and that perhaps there would be an option for the group to invest in flood insurance. But there's also the factor where, you know, I don't know how much coverage would be provided for such a small scale project, particularly given that there's such a high likelihood of flooding. So that kind of veers off into like a level of insurance policy detail that I don't have, but it's a really good question, and it's something that we'll need to kind of address and figure out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very quickly. So Opal's farm, I believe that is independently managed by, it's called Unity Unlimited, is a nonprofit based out of Fort Worth. So I believe they are a nonprofit farm. And I don't know if either of y'all have more info about them. No worries if not, but definitely a really interesting project. And then someone's asked a question about the agrarian land trust model and efforts to create an agrarian land trust here in Austin. That's a great question. I'm involved in some of those conversations about potential farmland community land trust, and I think Leah and Sari are to a certain extent as well. So that's something we would love to continue to explore. You know, right now, the Onion Creek site lands, those are owned by the city, owned by the Watershed Protection Department. But certainly more farmland and held in trust could be a really great way to see more food system projects here in Austin. I'm just seeing if there are any other questions. So maybe I'll take two more. I think we have just two more anyway. So how does your work and its expansion overlap with the reparations policy work upcoming? So I think this is about the community engagement piece of this. Hope I'm getting that right. And Leah, sorry if you're seeing this question, maybe that.
I can try to speak to it. I mean, explicitly, it doesn't overlap, like we haven't been coordinating, but conceptually, I think it does, in that we're using an equity framework and we would want to use the equity tool, and probably the same kind of philosophies that are underlying this kind of approach and the reparations policy work are at play. But yeah, there's not like, we're not explicitly coordinating about it yet.
Great. And then Last question. So were the inspiration farms led by municipal planning departments, like how this project is being managed by your teams? And if so, what was the transition process from municipal administration to community run and community owned farms in those cities? So in terms of the inspirations that we've put together, really all of those are independent projects from the get-go, from what I understand. And really the relationship between the organizations running the actual kind of farm operations and the municipal entity is a lease agreement. So with Opal's farm in Fort Worth, they are leasing out the land from the water authority, the water district. I believe with the Urbandale Farms in Vermont, some of that land was in Burlington's hands, the city of Burlington. But I believe, well, maybe Sardi or Leah, you know this better than I do, but it's actually owned by them at this point, maybe, or is it still leased out?
I don't remember that.
So it kind of varied that way, but I don't know of any examples where the city really kind of stood up a project from the ground up. And it kind of remains to be seen, I think, for us in this project, you know, the extent that the city will create something and stand it up from the beginning, or, you know, hopefully we're able to just work with partners and help an organization or two or coalition get the resources they need where they can really be in that position to be successful. And our relationship would be more of leasing that land out, providing those kind of hazard mitigation policies and resources, that kind of thing. And feel free to add, Leanne, sorry. No? Okay. All right, y'all. Well, thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Leah and Sari, for your time and expertise. This has been a really fun topic, and we'd love to continue the conversation with you outside this conference, or come present again somewhere else. So thanks so much.
Thank everybody for the
And thanks for moderating, Carol.
Yeah, thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks, y'all.
Oh, sorry, one more thing. Kelly, if you want to contact me, I have a resource for you about that super fun site. Bye.
Have a good one.
Bye. Bye.